Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for this ISSRM virtual presentation. My name is Becca Nixon and I'm a PhD student at Purdue University in Dr. Zhao Ma's Human Dimensions Lab. I will be presenting today on livelihood strategies, adaptation, and household structures in northwestern Pakistan. This is work I've done through a joint project between Purdue University and the University of Peshawar where we work with Dr. Bushra Khan. First, I want to give some background on our understanding of livelihood strategies, adaptation, and household structures. We know that many rural households engage in multiple livelihood strategies. For instance, households may have land in agricultural production while also having members working in day labor. Reasons for this diversification have often been conceptualized as either push or pull factors. That is, households may be pushed to diversify due to negative stressors, often related to seasonality or climate variability. Households may also be pulled into diversification by positive attractions such as market access, improved infrastructure, or increased demand for services. This diversification has been studied in multiple contexts, but has more recently been studied as an adaptation to social ecological change. When we think about adaptation more broadly, we understand it to be responses not only to climate change, but actually to ongoing uncertainty. This adaptation is embedded in specific contexts not only because of environmental variability, but also because of the unique cultural, political, and economic contexts in which adaptations are made. We also know that adaptive capacity, or the ability of an individual or system to adapt, varies and is influenced by multiple factors such as income, land tenure, education, and other forms of capital. Another influence on adaptive capacity at the household scale is the household structure or size. That is, how many people are a part of the household and how many generations are a part of that household, or how many wage earners or children are there. Generally, it has long been understood that intergenerational co-residence supports rural livelihoods. For instance, it has been repeatedly found that larger households are more likely to have off-farm income sources and are more likely to employ adaptation strategies. While household size has been repeatedly studied, we don't know much about the influence of household structure on adaptation and decision-making. In this study, we are trying to address this gap by looking specifically at joint families, which is a type of multi-generational families with 2 or more married children. This structure is particularly common in our study context of northwestern Pakistan. Specifically, we gathered data in 3 communities in northwestern Pakistan, Landaki, Janganjera, and Madian, which are located along the Swat and Kabul rivers. Before we get into our data, I want to share a brief overview of this area. Traditional livelihood strategies include agriculture and fishing. Tourism has seen a recent revitalization in the area after years of conflict and a massive flood compounded to essentially eliminate that option. Migration to urban areas is increasing, while at the same time local industry has increasingly been developed. However, the area is also experiencing stress from multiple compounding sources. Climate change is increasing the variability in precipitation and temperature, and while industry has provided job options for many, it also increases the stress on water quality and land access. As I mentioned, this area continues to rebuild after years of armed conflict, and a flood in 2010 destroyed large portions of infrastructure. In this context, we examine 3 specific research questions. First, we want to know what livelihood strategies are being employed in this context of social ecological change, and how decisions are being made about these strategies. Second, we want to know how households are adapting to these changes. Finally, we want to know if and how these adaptations and livelihood strategies relate to household structures. Much work on decision-making and adaptation assumes nuclear families or decision-making between a husband and wife. This work seeks to fill that gap in our understanding of adaptation and livelihood decision-making by looking at non-nuclear family structures. It is within this context that we examine 3 specific research questions. First, we want to know what livelihood strategies are being employed in this context of social ecological change and how decisions are made about these strategies. Second, we want to know how households are adapting to these changes. Finally, we want to know if and how these adaptations and livelihood strategies relate to household structures. Much work on decision-making and adaptation assumes nuclear families or decision-making between a husband and wife. So this work seeks to fill that gap in our understanding of adaptation and livelihood decisions in non-nuclear family structures. In order to assess adaptation in this context, we collected data from 445 households in 3 communities. Their survey was based on findings from interviews conducted in the study area in 2018 and theoretical insights from a review of literature. We used data for descriptive and bivariate analysis of the survey data. Now I'm going to present some preliminary results from our analysis. First, we'll go over a quick overview of our survey respondents. Then I want to talk about livelihood and adaptation strategies by location and family type to help us understand the ways in which these strategies differ across these factors. Finally, I'll talk briefly about who is involved in decision making within joint and nuclear households. As you can see here, we ask questions about household size, income, land ownership, and livelihood strategies. We can talk more about any of these, but I do want to draw your attention to a few of these indicators. First, you can see that the majority of respondents in our sample report living in joint families. While data on joint families is unavailable at a national scale, this is fairly representative of the UN estimate that 55% of Pakistani households are multi-generational, which is a structure that does include joint families. I also want to point out that the average number of livelihood strategies show that engaging in multiple livelihood strategies is the norm in this context. I also want to highlight the difference in income. First, across locations, we see that Jangajera reports a lower income than both Madian and Landaki. And second, joint families report a higher income than nuclear households in this context. Moving on to livelihood strategies, you can see here the diversity of strategies employed by the households in our sample. You can also see that crop production and animal husbandry are 2 of the most common. But I also want to highlight some of the differences. First, you can see that day labor, a livelihood strategy associated with high variability and low income, is more common in Jangajera and among nuclear families. Commerce is associated with Madian and Landaki as well as joint families. This is often in reference to working at or owning small shops. This might be supported by the tourist industry in these 2 locations, as we can see in the report of the hotel industry as well. Finally, remittances are also more likely to be reported by joint families and households in Madian and Landaki. Next, I want to talk about adaptation strategies in this context. Here you can see the strategies reported by respondents, and I want to highlight just a few. You can see that respondents in Jangajera were more likely to report increasing agricultural inputs, even though crop production was actually more common in other locations. We posit that this could be because Jangajera is closer to urban centers. Thus, respondents there may have easier access to inputs and extension services that often distribute these products. Following the livelihood strategy data, we see more households reporting diversification through starting a business in Madian, where most of the tourism development has occurred. Finally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we see more joint families reporting migration as an adaptation strategy, perhaps because of the surplus in labor in these larger households. Finally, I also want to talk a bit about decision-making processes across joint and nuclear families. When you look at respondents who report making decisions with a family member about livelihood strategies, there is not much difference across family structures. That is, joint and nuclear families are fairly similar in how they report making decisions with family members. The exception here is in the case of commerce as a livelihood strategy. There are many possibilities for this exception. Perhaps running a business, especially as a new livelihood strategy, requires additional support in comparison to traditional strategies such as agricultural and animal husbandry. When you look more broadly, however, the similar responses highlight that we cannot assume a clear decision-making structure in these different household structures. For example, we cannot assume that there's a singular decision-maker in a nuclear family or many decision-makers in a joint family. Also to note is that the 2 most frequently cited family members involved in decision-making in addition to the head was the household head's father or brother. This reminds us that household decision-makers are not always the husband and wife in these contexts. Okay, now on to some concluding thoughts. Overall, this project illustrates that joint families report a higher income, more adaptation strategies, larger land ownership, and more livelihood strategies than nuclear families. More broadly, our findings confirm previous research demonstrating that households with multiple livelihood strategies are more likely to report a higher income. This study, however, counters assumptions that larger family sizes are associated with poverty. In this context of joint families, it appears to be the opposite, that large joint families support more livelihood strategies and have a higher adaptive capacity than nuclear families that tend to be smaller. This study also highlights the ways in which adaptations are context-specific, even within a relatively small geographic region. For example, we see differences in the tourism industry and the livelihood options it supports. Thus, this difference in income, livelihood strategies, and subsequent adaptations that we're seeing are somewhat reflective of the options available in each location. This research also illustrates the complexity of household decision-making and gives us a broader understanding of negotiation within a household. Specifically, it highlights that we cannot assume that the decision-makers are husband and wife when multiple decision-makers are present in a household. This can have implications for data collection when deciding who to interview or survey about household decisions. And I believe that this should also be considered for information dissemination. That is, if extension services or climate information is available, it should be made available to the entire household to support the cooperative decision-making processes that occur in these structures. Overall, this research illustrates that joint family or multi-generational household structures should be considered when examining households' adaptation and livelihood strategies to further understand how these structures relate to adaptation and decision-making. Specifically, a more nuanced examination of members involved in household decision-making is needed, whether examining nuclear or joint families. Finally, we highlight the diversity of strategies employed within and across households, pointing to the need for policies that are flexible and cross-sectorial in order to support households' diverse strategies. Thank you all for your time. I want to thank the Pakistan-United States Science and Technology Cooperation Program, and specifically our partners at the University of Peshawar. I look forward to your questions and feedback in the Q&A.